how they interacted with Rome. The Pharisees were a separatist group, in a way. They realized that they had to deal with Rome and the Roman government, but they didn't like it, and they believed that the best way to deal with Rome was to pretend it didn't exist and just deal with Mosaic law. You paid your taxes, you did that just so that they wouldn't bother you, but you didn't recognize Rome as a real power in most of your day-to-day life. And you spoke out when Rome tried to insist on worship, which we'll get to talking about later when we get to talk about Pontius Pilate. The Sadducees worked hand in glove with Rome. They knew that Rome could destroy the temple if it wanted to, and very often they let Rome decide things for them. They got along a lot better than the Pharisees did. So another group that comes in at the time, mainly because one of the disciples was involved with it, and they were the zealots. They wanted to overthrow Rome. They believed in a violent overthrow. Pharisees were sympathetic to the zealots. They didn't want an armed revolt. But they were sympathetic because they didn't like the fact that, the reality of Roman rule. So what's all this to say about Nicodemus? Nicodemus was a Pharisee. That's where it came from. That's where his heart was. He more than likely was trained in religious law and Mosaic law from an early age. He more than likely spent his whole time doing it. And he probably, of the Pharisees, was probably one of the more powerful and the more wealthy of them. We know that because he, along with another Pharisee, were part of a group called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was governing the government of religion of Judaism at the time. And the Sanhedrin had high priests, elders, and Pharisees. High priests tended to be more Sadducees. The elders tended to be people who had the lineage from Levi, the Levites. And the Pharisees were the ones that were powerful in Hasidic law, enough to have influence. Not all Pharisees were on the Sanhedrin, but it's believed that both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were on the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the group, was the governing authority that brought Jesus to Pilate for trial and sentencing. The head of the Sanhedrin was the high priest, by the name of Caiaphas. Caiaphas's father-in-law was Annas, who was a high priest before Caiaphas. The very high priest, the head of it, was mostly passed down in such a way. It was a bit of nepotism going on. So, Caiaphas, as a Sadducee, didn't want Jesus, had a problem with Jesus mainly because Jesus was encroaching on their power and influence. So they brought charges against it. As Nicodemus is a part of the Sanhedrin, as well as probably Joseph of Arimathea, probably, most scholars believe, resisted the singling out or the persecution of Jesus. They believed that Jesus was real and the Messiah. We're not sure when Nicodemus came to that belief, though more than likely what was clear in a clear encounter that led him to that belief was when? Do you know? That when Nicodemus maybe started to believe that Jesus was a Messiah? When he visited him at night. When he snuck there and Jesus said, and Jesus told him what? You must be born again. Now we don't know that Nicodemus, the Bible doesn't say that Nicodemus left that night a believer, and we get the impression that he was still confused about what Jesus was talking about. But at some point it sunk in. Because both he and Joseph of Arimathea provided not just a tomb by which Jesus was buried, but the linens and the myrrh and all the burial spices by which his body was taken care of, which at the time was not an insignificant expense. It cost a lot of money. They were probably wealthy. They made some sort of commitment. So both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, we can understand, were believers. There's some research that says that following Jesus at the beginning of the church, that both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were the earlier arguers for the Christian way, that they were the early Christians. Again, some scholars might dispute that, whether or not they did give up being Jews in order to become Christians. We don't know. But certainly they came to believe something that most Jews, certainly most Pharisees, didn't believe at the time, that Jesus was the Messiah. Any questions yet? I threw a lot at you. Well, it doesn't refer to Nicodemus. It refers to Joseph of Arimathea. But scholars pull out from not so much the Gospels, but by the writings of a writer by the name of a Jewish historian at the time, Josephus, who wrote about that time. He was a kind of a Jewish historian by which we get a lot of information about Jesus and about Rome and about a lot of these things going on. And that's where we have the cooperation or the partnership almost between Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea provided the tomb, so it's logical that he probably provided the myrrh and a lot of the burial spices, but Josephus and a few others believe that Nicodemus was a part of that too as well. The Bible doesn't mention Nicodemus at that part. The only time you really get a part of Nicodemus clearly is his encounter with Jesus. I'm throwing that extra stuff in as extra. Okay. What's important about all the different groups and everything else isn't just me showing off what I've researched. It's to say that the Pharisees, as much as they get a bad rap in the Bible, and they do, especially in John, they're called den of vipers. They're called, Jesus is quite harsh on the Pharisees. For the most part, the Pharisees were the equivalent to the local pastors. And they had the most encounter with people. And what Jesus was criticizing wasn't so much their existence, but the fact that they were being too legalistic and requiring too much. They were letting the Mosaic law come in between the relationship between the average person and God, rather than being the vehicle by which they can come closer to God. And that's what Mosaic law was supposed to do, was it was supposed to bring you closer to God. But it had become so legalistic that people got separated. They became too concerned with whether or not they were doing every little thing right, that they've got to have a relationship. Kind of like a child who is over-regulated in their house or over-disciplined has a difficult time having a strong relationship with their parents. We can't bring somebody to love us by fear. Right? And if you're constantly telling the people that if they do any little thing wrong, that God's going to punish them, how are they going to learn to love God rather than just fear God? So I think that's the biggest thing that Jesus was criticizing, was not criticizing their presence as much as where their attention was directed. The Sadducees, quite frankly, were separated from the people. And they didn't care whether the people liked them or not. They cared about whether they kept up their position in the temple and the money kept flowing. People kept paying their taxes. How that comes important to Pilate is that with these groups being the power structures within the Jewish community, Pilate wanted to have control. He didn't want to let those groups have enough power that they would threaten Rome's influence. What's your impression of Pontius Pilate when you read the gospel stories? Sorry, the phone is ringing. Certainly you have an impression. He comes off as somewhat benign, right? In a way. Sorry, I'm going to try to mute. He comes across as the least disinterested. You know, that he doesn't care. This is your problem, don't bother me with it. And there is even the scene, there is even the action in one of the Gospels where he publicly washes his hand of the whole thing. I don't find this man to be guilty, so I'm washing my hands of it, right? So we get the impression that Pontius Pilate, even though he was a Roman governor, was not a bad guy. History teaches us something different. History says that Pontius Pilate was a ruthless governor. And the book points that out. And the book points out 3 cases of his ruthlessness, right? One is that when he comes in, he puts up the images of Rome facing the temple for the very purpose that they should be worshiping the emperor or the Caesar, knowing full well that the Jewish people would have a problem with that. And in fact, they did. History says that after he put up those images, close to 7,000 people gathered in protest and encircled his quarters praying for him. And he wanted to just slaughter them. But he also knew that that wouldn't be good, so he kind of backed off. But other times he didn't. There's another case where they wanted to offer sacrifice in honor of a prophet, and so he sent a bunch of Roman soldiers, dressed them up as average people, armed them with clubs, and had them just beat the crap out of people. Kill some of them. And he also slaughtered another demonstrator. So he was not a nice guy. He was ruthless. And he was also governor for a reason. He had a connection to why he was governor. his wife was the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. So he had his position pretty much whether he for as long as he wanted, and he was there for 10 years, which, considering the four people in front of the four governors before him, all together served 20. He was the longest serving governor. His family name was Pontius. His title was Pilate, which is another word for governor. So Pilate wasn't his last name. Okay? Pontius was his last name. I don't know what his first name was. But his connection was to Caesar Augustus, but it was a little less than perfect in that his wife's mother was the daughter of Caesar Augustus, but the illegitimate daughter of Caesar Augustus. That's not all important. What's important about Pontius Pilate is that there's something different that's going on in the encounter with Jesus. The scriptures, the message of the Gospels, and this occurs in all the gospel accounts of Jesus in front of Pilate, is that he is reacting to Jesus in a different way than he would react to the average person coming before him. He is less invested in showing his power. And one needs to ask the question, why? And the reason why is that he was touched somehow by Jesus' presence. That he sensed that there was something different with this person in front of him. We get that idea. Because Pontius Pilate was not a nice guy, and he had no qualms in executing people, and he had no qualms in executing someone who might be threatening his power. So if the average person was brought before him, who was a rabble-rouser, who was claiming to have power, who was claiming to be, was inciting people for a revolution or revolt, a zealot or somebody like that, Pontius Pilate would have disposed them in a brutal manner without a question. He would have done so without even thinking. And done. Right? But we get the sense from the Gospels that he struggled with it. And one of the Gospels says that his wife, who had a considerable power in herself, had dreamed about it and said, do not persecute or do not prosecute this man. So for whatever reason, he was rendered less ruthless. And I think the gospel story says that even those who are not religious, even those who are not faithful, even those who are not Jewish, even those who are not seeking, are impacted, are touched, or reached by the Son of God. And even those who are religious and raised in a different way are touched by the Son of God. that Jesus, and this is why I believe the book put them both together in the same chapter, even though one was a religious man and one was a very secular man, is that they were both reached in the same way. They were both pulled out of their normal environments by their encounter with Jesus, right? That they were both impacted by Jesus' mere presence. They saw something else going on here, and they responded in whatever way they felt they could. Somewhat limited way with Pontius Pilate, because he didn't end up, he did leave the decision to the Sanhedrin to crucify Jesus. He didn't pardon him. He gave the option for Jesus to be pardoned, but he didn't overrule them, which he very well could have. He had the power to. And Nicodemus, who even though he came to Jesus in the middle of the night when nobody was watching. And he might have argued on Jesus' behalf, but he didn't leave the Sanhedrin. But they came one step closer, both of them. And they were both impacted. So Jesus touched them in a way. And that's the power of the Passion narrative. Is that you can't encounter Jesus without being affected, without being touched. It's impossible. That's the message I get out of it. This is a more complicated chapter of the book. The one I struggled with the most as far as trying to interpret for you guys. I hope I did okay. Back on, but you can also see those religious leaders in our time who are working class and those who are very upper class, those who like their money coming in and they like the power and the influence they have. There was a religious leader or televangelist of some sort, I think, who went on TV to have everybody pray to him, pray to God, Well, pray to God that he might have a new jet, because it was important for God's work that he have a fancier jet. Because he was doing God's work, and it was more important for him to get to that work better and more comfortably. Yep. I'm going to shut my mic off on this one, but